He had commanded loyalty, inspired fear, and built an empire without ever seeing the faces of the people who served him. But on that quiet morning, a single ordinary greeting would shake the walls around his carefully guarded heart. "Good morning." Naomi Carter spoke the words as naturally as if she were greeting a neighbor across a white picket fence instead of the most feared man in the city. The silver serving tray rested steadily in her hands as warm coffee released gentle curls of steam into the cool morning air, carrying the rich aroma of freshly roasted beans through the marble dining hall. Sunlight poured through towering windows nearly 20 feet high, painting long golden stripes across polished Italian stone that reflected crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen stars. Every servant in the room immediately stopped breathing. Forks froze inches above fine china. A housekeeper nearly dropped a linen napkin before catching it at the last second. Even the head butler, a man whose expression rarely changed after 30 years of service, felt his pulse skip beneath his perfectly pressed collar. No one greeted Vincent Moretti that way. They announced his arrival. They lowered their heads. They called him sir in voices that trembled with careful respect. They waited to be acknowledged before speaking a single word. But Naomi had done none of those things. She had simply smiled. Vincent stood near the entrance, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored with flawless precision, his white cane resting lightly against the marble floor rather than supporting his weight. Though completely blind, he carried himself with such unwavering confidence that strangers often forgot he could not see them. His posture never faltered. His breathing remained calm and measured. His head tilted only slightly, as though the smallest vibration in the room carried stories invisible to everyone else. People said he could recognize every member of his household by the sound of their footsteps alone. Others claimed he could hear a heartbeat change when someone lied. Whether the stories were true no longer mattered. Everyone believed them. Everyone except Naomi. She had arrived only a week earlier with one weathered suitcase, sensible shoes, and years of quiet experience caring for her father after diabetes had taken his eyesight. Blindness had never frightened her. Pity had. She had promised herself long ago that she would never speak to someone as though blindness erased the person standing in front of her. Behind Vincent, two impeccably dressed security officers exchanged uncertain glances. Across the room, the executive housekeeper slowly closed her eyes, silently preparing for the young woman's immediate dismissal. Rule number 1 had been broken before breakfast. Never treat Mr. Moretti like an ordinary man. The silence stretched across the dining hall until it became almost tangible, interrupted only by the distant ticking of an antique grandfather clock and the faint crackle from logs burning inside the enormous limestone fireplace. Vincent remained perfectly still. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted. It was not a smile. It was something far rarer. Curiosity. 7 days earlier, Naomi Carter stepped through the wrought iron gates of the Moretti estate carrying everything she owned inside a single navy blue suitcase with one loose wheel that rattled across the long stone driveway. The mansion stood at the top of the hill like something lifted from another century, its limestone walls glowing softly beneath the early morning sun, while fountains whispered across perfectly trimmed gardens stretching farther than she could comfortably see. She had cleaned beautiful homes before, but nothing prepared her for a place where silence itself seemed expensive. Every polished window reflected discipline. Every hedge appeared measured to the exact inch. Every employee moved with practiced precision, speaking only when necessary and never louder than the quiet splash of water echoing through the courtyard. A woman in her early 60s approached with straight shoulders and silver hair pinned into a flawless bun. Eleanor Whitmore, the executive housekeeper, had managed the estate longer than most employees had been alive. Her tailored navy uniform looked as immaculate as the marble floors beneath her sensible shoes. She greeted Naomi with professional courtesy before handing her a leather folder embossed with the Moretti family crest. Inside rested 27 house rules printed on thick cream-colored paper. Naomi had expected instructions about cleaning schedules, guest rooms, and security procedures. Instead, the first page contained only one sentence written in bold letters. Never treat Mr. Moretti like an ordinary man. Naomi read it twice before looking up. Eleanor did not smile. She simply continued walking through the grand entrance where towering columns supported ceilings almost 25 feet above the gleaming foyer. Paintings in ornate gold frames lined the walls beside fresh white orchids arranged with mathematical perfection. Every detail communicated quiet authority. As they walked, Eleanor explained the remaining rules with measured patience. Never interrupt unless spoken to. Never touch the boss without permission. Never offer assistance unless requested. Never describe what you see unless he asks. Never assume he needs help because he cannot see. Never ask about his eyesight. Never discuss his personal life with anyone inside or outside the estate. Naomi listened carefully, yet something inside her remained unsettled. None of the rules sounded cruel. They sounded lonely. When Eleanor finally paused beside a sunlit breakfast room overlooking acres of emerald lawn, she lowered her voice. Mr. Moretti values order above everything else. The people who work here respect that. They know where the boundaries are. Naomi nodded politely before asking the only question that came naturally. Does anyone ever just talk to him? Eleanor blinked, surprised enough to hesitate. After a long moment, she answered with quiet honesty. Not anymore. The words lingered in the air long after they continued their tour. Throughout the afternoon, Naomi watched employees rehearse every interaction with almost ceremonial precision. A gardener announced fresh roses as though delivering official reports. A chef described lunch menus with careful formality. Drivers addressed every sentence with respectful titles. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke casually. Nobody forgot themselves. Standing alone, beside the kitchen window as late afternoon sunlight warmed the wooden countertop, Naomi remembered countless evenings guiding her own father through their modest home after blindness had slowly claimed his world. He had hated careful voices more than darkness itself. Do not speak to me like broken glass, he used to tell her with a gentle smile. Speak to me like your father. Naomi quietly folded her apron, looked across the peaceful estate, and without realizing it, made a promise that would change far more than her own future. The following morning unfolded with the same flawless precision Naomi had observed since arriving at the estate. Yet beneath the polished routine, she sensed an invisible current guiding every movement through the mansion. Fresh flowers appeared in crystal vases before sunrise. Newspapers were arranged perfectly square on the library table. Breakfast was prepared exactly at 7:30, neither a minute early nor a minute late. Nobody needed to check the clock because everyone seemed to move according to an unwritten rhythm that revolved around one man. Naomi spent the morning dusting the grand hallway where portraits of generations past overlooked the marble staircase. The silence was interrupted only by the distant melody of a piano drifting from another wing of the house and the soft ticking of an antique clock that had probably measured decades of family history. As she polished the carved walnut banister, she noticed something unusual. Every employee paused, almost instinctively, before crossing the center hallway. Some straightened their uniforms. Others lowered their voices. One young footman quietly stepped backward to avoid making unnecessary noise. Nobody had received instructions. They simply knew. Moments later she heard it. The steady tap of a white cane against polished marble echoed through the corridor with calm, deliberate rhythm. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. The sound carried absolute certainty rather than hesitation. Vincent Moretti walked alone through the mansion without reaching for walls or searching for direction. His shoulders remained perfectly square. His pace never quickened or slowed. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating silver threads hidden among his dark hair and the crisp lines of his tailored charcoal suit. Although his eyes no longer perceived the light surrounding him, his face remained composed with quiet confidence that drew every person's attention the moment he entered a room. Employees greeted him one by one in carefully rehearsed voices. Good morning, Mr. Moretti. The gardens are ready for your inspection. The chef has prepared your usual breakfast. Your meeting has been confirmed for 9 o'clock. Every sentence sounded polished, respectful, and strangely distant, as though they were speaking to a monument instead of a living person. Vincent acknowledged each greeting with a slight nod, recognizing every voice without asking for names. Thank you, Eleanor. Good morning, Daniel. I appreciate it, Margaret. He never missed a single person. Naomi watched from the far end of the hallway, fascinated less by his blindness than by the invisible wall standing between him and everyone else. Nobody smiled naturally around him. Nobody shared an ordinary observation about the weather or commented on the beautiful morning sunlight spilling across the floors. The mansion felt less like a home than a carefully choreographed performance repeated every day without variation. While arranging books inside the reading room, Naomi noticed Vincent stop beside an open window. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming lavender from the gardens below. He stood quietly for several seconds, his face lifting almost imperceptibly toward the warmth touching his skin. For the briefest moment, the powerful figure everyone feared seemed simply like a man enjoying fresh air after a long night. Before anyone else could speak, Naomi found herself smiling softly. "It is going to be a beautiful day," she said almost absent-mindedly, her voice carrying the same warmth she had once used with her father. The hallway became perfectly still once again, and although Vincent did not move, something in his expression suggested that he had just heard words no one had offered him in a very long time. The quiet tension that settled over the mansion after Naomi's casual remark did not disappear with the morning sun. Instead, it lingered through every hallway and every polished room like an unanswered question. Eleanor gently reminded the staff to continue their duties, but whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Some believed the new housemaid would not last until the weekend. Others wondered whether Mr. Moretti had simply chosen to ignore what happened. Naomi paid little attention to either possibility. She spent the next hour arranging fresh flowers in the music room, replacing faded white lilies with new blooms whose delicate fragrance drifted through the open French doors. Outside, robins hopped across the trimmed lawn while a gentle breeze carried the distant sound of flowing water from the stone fountain. It was difficult to imagine fear existing in a place that looked so peaceful. Shortly before noon, Eleanor approached with calm urgency. "Mr. Moretti will be reviewing documents in the West Library. Please bring him fresh coffee in exactly 10 minutes. Naomi nodded and prepared the silver tray with careful hands. The porcelain cup rested beside a small crystal glass of water and a neatly folded linen napkin. She walked through the corridor at an unhurried pace, balancing the tray as sunlight reflected softly across its polished surface. The West Library was one of the oldest rooms in the estate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves wrapped around dark walnut walls while a rolling ladder stood beside thousands of leather-bound volumes collected over generations. The scent of aged paper mixed with cedar would create an atmosphere that felt warm despite the room's impressive size. Vincent sat near the tall windows with several documents arranged neatly before him. His fingertips rested lightly on embossed pages prepared in raised lettering, allowing him to read through touch with remarkable speed. Across from him sat two financial advisors speaking in measured voices. Naomi quietly entered and placed the coffee exactly where Eleanor had instructed. "Thank you," Mr. Moretti said without lifting his head. His voice remained calm, neither warm nor distant. As Naomi turned to leave, she noticed the afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting a bright beam directly across the edge of a Persian rug that had curled upwards slightly where the heavy wooden floor met the carpet. It was barely noticeable to anyone looking straight ahead, but from where she stood the raised edge caught her attention immediately. Vincent rose from his chair at the same moment, folding his cane before taking several confident steps toward the doorway. Neither advisor noticed the uneven rug. They were still gathering papers and discussing schedules for the following week. Naomi's heart tightened with familiar instinct. She remembered countless afternoons guiding her father around loose rugs and uneven sidewalks without making him feel helpless. Before she could reconsider the house rules, the words escaped naturally. "There is a small fold in the rug about 2 feet ahead on your left." Vincent stopped instantly. The room became perfectly silent. Naomi stepped forward without hesitation and gently reached for the edge of the carpet instead of his arm, smoothing the fabric flat against the hardwood floor with one careful motion. "There you go," she said with an easy smile. "Now the path is clear." Vincent remained motionless for several seconds. His advisors stared in astonishment, expecting a sharp correction that never came. Instead, Vincent slowly tilted his head toward the sound of Naomi's voice. For reasons he could not yet explain, her quiet thoughtfulness felt nothing like pity. It felt like trust. Vincent continued toward the doorway, but the easy certainty that usually guided every step had quietly given way to something far less familiar. He was no longer thinking about the library, the financial reports waiting on his desk, or the carefully planned meetings filling the afternoon. His thoughts remained fixed on the young woman who had flattened a rug instead of grabbing his arm, who had warned him without making him feel fragile, and who had spoken with the effortless kindness most people reserved for family. After the advisors excused themselves, the library settled into peaceful silence broken only by the distant rustling of oak leaves brushing against the windows. Vincent rested one hand lightly on the back of a leather chair. Eleanor entered a moment later carrying another folder for his afternoon schedule. Before she could begin reading, he interrupted her with a calm question that surprised them both. "Tell me about Naomi Carter." Eleanor hesitated. She had expected questions about the meeting or tomorrow's charity luncheon, never about one of the newest employees. "She is 27 years old, sir. Excellent references. Very dependable. Quiet. Hardworking." Vincent listened without speaking. After several seconds, he asked another question. "Has she worked with anyone who was blind before?" Eleanor glanced at the employment file resting in her hands. "Yes, sir. Her father lost his eyesight nearly 12 years ago. She became his primary caregiver while working 2 jobs and attending community college part-time. She eventually left school to care for him full-time until he passed away 3 years ago." The room grew still once more. Vincent lowered his head slightly, as though the simple facts carried unexpected weight. "That explains it," he murmured almost to himself. "She does not hear blindness before she hears the person." Eleanor remained silent because there was nothing to add. For years she had watched respected politicians, accomplished business leaders, celebrated musicians, and lifelong friends visit the estate. Every one of them adjusted their voice the moment they stood before Vincent. They slowed their words. They chose each sentence carefully. Some became overly helpful. Others avoided ordinary conversation altogether. Their intentions were almost always kind, yet kindness wrapped inside caution often felt colder than indifference. Naomi had somehow stepped around that invisible barrier without realizing it existed. Later that afternoon, Naomi worked quietly inside the conservatory, watering rows of orchids and trimming faded blossoms beneath a glass ceiling that filled the room with soft golden light. She hummed an old gospel hymn under her breath while arranging fresh soil around delicate roots, completely unaware that Vincent had chosen to walk there without announcing himself. He paused just outside the doorway, listening. There was no nervous silence, no sudden scrambling to stand perfectly still. Only the gentle splash of a nearby fountain, birds singing beyond the garden walls, and Naomi's warm voice blending naturally with the peaceful afternoon. "Beautiful flowers," he observed. Naomi looked up and smiled before remembering he could not see the orchids stretching across the room. "They smell even better today," she replied cheerfully. "The white ones just opened this morning. You should come by every spring." Vincent found himself smiling almost imperceptibly, a quiet expression so rare that even he barely recognized it. For the first time in many years, he realized someone had invited him to enjoy the season instead of apologizing for everything he could no longer see. Autumn rain arrived just before dawn, covering the estate in a silver mist that softened every edge of the sprawling gardens and wrapped the mansion in peaceful silence. Inside, the household followed its familiar rhythm, but Vincent sensed a subtle difference that had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time in years, he found himself listening for one particular set of footsteps among dozens that crossed the marble floors each morning. Naomi never hurried. Her pace remained steady, her shoes producing a gentle rhythm he had already learned to recognize without effort. She greeted everyone exactly the same way, from the gardeners trimming hedges outside to Eleanor organizing breakfast in the kitchen. There was no calculation in her kindness, no attempt to impress anyone. It was simply who she was. After breakfast, Vincent prepared for a private strategy meeting with several senior advisors in the East Conference Room. The long mahogany table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath antique chandeliers, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the lake. Leather folders were arranged with perfect precision, and every chair had been placed exactly where Vincent expected it. Naomi entered only briefly to refill water glasses before quietly returning toward the doorway. As she reached the hall, one sentence drifting from inside the room made her pause without intending to listen. One advisor calmly suggested relocating a large charitable scholarship program that Vincent had funded for years, explaining that the budget would appear stronger if those resources were redirected elsewhere. The proposal sounded polished and logical, yet something about the man's tone felt strangely disconnected from the purpose behind the program. Naomi remembered the framed photographs she had dusted only 2 days earlier, showing smiling students standing beside Vincent at graduation ceremonies. She remembered Eleanor mentioning that many of those young people had become teachers, nurses, and community leaders because someone had believed in them when nobody else could. Naomi quietly stepped back toward the open doorway before anyone noticed she had hesitated. "Excuse me," she said respectfully, her voice gentle enough that everyone turned without alarm. "I am sorry for speaking out of turn, but may I ask one question?" The room fell silent. Vincent turned his head toward her voice. "Go ahead." Naomi folded her hands in front of her apron. If those scholarships help people build better lives, would saving money today really be worth taking away someone else's chance tomorrow? Her words contained no accusation. They carried only honest curiosity. Several advisors exchanged uncomfortable glances before lowering their eyes to the documents in front of them. Vincent remained completely still. He could hear something the others could not. Nobody around the table rushed to defend the proposal because every heartbeat in the room had quietly changed. The advisor who had spoken first cleared his throat before admitting that the recommendation had been based entirely on financial efficiency rather than long-term community impact. Vincent slowly closed the folder resting beneath his fingertips. "Then we will keep the scholarship program exactly as it is," he said calmly. "Some investments cannot be measured in dollars alone." As the meeting resumed, Naomi slipped quietly back into the hallway, believing the conversation was over. She never realized that from that moment forward, Vincent no longer viewed her as simply another employee. He had begun to trust not only her kindness, but also the quiet honesty that guided every word she chose to speak. That evening, the rain finally gave way to a clear sky, and the mansion settled into the quiet rhythm that always followed a long day of meetings. Warm light spilled from antique lamps across polished hardwood floors while the scent of cedar drifted through the central hallway. Naomi finished folding fresh linens before carrying them upstairs, where the guest suites overlooked the gardens now sparkling beneath the moonlight. As she passed the music room, she heard the soft notes of an old piano recording floating through hidden speakers. She smiled without thinking. It reminded her of Sunday evenings at home when her father would sit on the porch listening to neighborhood children laugh, while she described every color of the sunset he could no longer see. She continued humming the same familiar melody as she worked, unaware that Vincent had paused several yards away after finishing a phone call. He recognized the tune immediately. It was one his own mother had loved decades earlier, long before the weight of responsibility had replaced ordinary moments with endless schedules and careful conversations. He remained quietly where he was, allowing the music and Naomi's gentle voice to fill the hallway without interruption. After a few moments, he spoke. "My mother used to listen to that song every Sunday afternoon." Naomi turned, pleasantly surprised rather than startled. "It is a beautiful song," she answered. "My father always said music painted pictures that nobody could take away." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. He was silent long enough that Naomi wondered whether she had said too much. Instead, he asked a question no one in the household had ever heard him ask an employee. "What was your father like?" Naomi rested the folded towels on a nearby table and smiled with quiet affection. "He was stubborn. He insisted on mowing the lawn even after losing his eyesight. He burned pancakes almost every Saturday because he refused to let me cook breakfast alone. He laughed every time I tried to organize his toolbox because he claimed he knew exactly where everything was." Vincent let out the faintest breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Not because the stories were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. They belonged to a real family instead of a carefully protected public image. Naomi looked toward the windows where moonlight reflected across the gardens. "Sometimes people treated him like he disappeared when he lost his sight," she said softly. "But he was still the same father who embarrassed me with terrible jokes at the grocery store and insisted on cheering the loudest at my high school graduation. The only thing he needed was for people to remember that." Vincent lowered his head slightly. Nobody had spoken to him about blindness without turning it into sympathy or inspiration. Naomi spoke about it the way someone discussed rain, seasons, or growing older. It was simply part of life, never the whole story. After another thoughtful silence, Vincent asked the question that had quietly lived in his heart since the morning she first greeted him. "Why are you never afraid of saying the wrong thing to me?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Because I am not trying to speak perfectly. I am simply trying to speak honestly. If I make a mistake, I trust that you will tell me." Vincent stood motionless beneath the warm glow of the chandelier. In boardrooms, people measured every word before speaking to him. Guests rehearsed compliments. Advisors calculated every sentence. Yet this young woman believed honesty was safer than perfection. For reasons he could not fully explain, that simple belief reached deeper than years of flawless respect ever had. The next morning arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air, and golden sunlight stretched across the eastern side of the estate, warming the stone terraces where dew still clung to every blade of grass. The household moved through another carefully organized day, yet Vincent quietly changed one detail that nobody questioned. Instead of asking Eleanor to accompany him during his morning walk through the gardens, he requested only that Naomi prepare the path by ensuring the outdoor furniture had been arranged after the previous night's rain. Naomi accepted the task without reading anything unusual into the request. She straightened a pair of wooden chairs overlooking the lake, brushed fallen leaves from the brick pathway, and placed fresh chrysanthemums beside the fountain before stepping back to admire the peaceful scene. A few minutes later, Vincent approached with his familiar steady pace, his white cane tapping gently against the stone. Naomi greeted him with the same natural warmth she had shown every day since arriving. "Good morning. The air feels wonderful today." Vincent nodded. "It does." Then, without explanation, he intentionally turned toward a narrow side path he rarely used. Eleanor noticed immediately from several yards away. The pathway remained perfectly safe, but a low tree branch extended farther than usual after weeks of healthy autumn growth. Any longtime employee would have rushed forward the moment they recognized where Vincent was walking. Naomi did not rush. She simply observed him for another step before speaking in the same calm voice she always used. "There is a low branch about 3 feet ahead. If you stay a little to your right, you will pass comfortably beneath it." Vincent adjusted his direction exactly as she suggested. Neither surprise nor embarrassment crossed his face. They continued walking side by side through the garden while birds gathered near the fountain searching for breakfast among the flower beds. A few minutes later, another small obstacle appeared where a gardener had left an empty watering can beside the path. Naomi smiled gently. "One more step, and then a watering can is about 2 feet in front of your left shoe." Vincent changed course again without hesitation. "Thank you," he replied simply. There was no dramatic rescue, no unnecessary concern. Only two people sharing an ordinary walk on a beautiful morning. From the terrace, Eleanor watched quietly. She finally understood what made Naomi different from everyone else. She never anticipated disaster. She simply shared information when it was useful, then allowed Vincent to continue living independently. She protected his confidence instead of replacing it with dependence. After nearly half an hour, they reached a wooden bench overlooking the lake. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine trees and damp earth across the water, while distant geese drifted peacefully beneath a cloudless sky. Vincent rested one hand on the back of the bench before speaking almost to himself. "For many years, people believed helping me meant doing everything for me." Naomi looked toward the shimmering water before answering softly. "My father used to tell me that real help gives someone more freedom, not less." Vincent remained silent for several long seconds. He realized that every conversation, every thoughtful warning, every ordinary greeting Naomi had offered came from exactly the same place. She had never been trying to earn his approval. She had simply chosen to treat him with the same quiet dignity she believed every person deserved. And in that simple choice, Vincent discovered something far more valuable than perfect loyalty. He discovered peace. 3 days later, the Moretti estate welcomed community leaders, longtime employees, scholarship recipients, and close business partners for the annual Autumn Appreciation Dinner, a tradition Vincent had continued for years because he believed gratitude deserved its own place on the calendar. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the grand ballroom, while soft piano music drifted through conversations that sounded lighter than usual. Long tables overflowed with fresh flowers gathered from the estate gardens, and the scent of roasted herbs and warm bread filled the elegant room with quiet comfort. Naomi moved gracefully between guests, serving coffee with the same calm smile she had offered on her very first morning. Nothing about her routine suggested she expected to be noticed. She simply continued treating every person with equal kindness, whether they wore an expensive tailored suit or a gardener's work boots. As dessert plates were cleared away, Vincent slowly rose from his chair. The room settled into respectful silence almost immediately. Everyone expected a brief speech thanking donors and guests before the evening concluded. Instead, Vincent rested both hands lightly on the polished wood of the table and spoke with unusual softness. Every year, I thank people for their loyalty, their professionalism, and their commitment. Those things matter. They always will. He paused for several thoughtful seconds before continuing. But this year I learned something I should have understood long ago. Respect is not measured by how carefully people avoid offending you. It is measured by whether they allow you to remain fully yourself. Curious glances spread quietly across the ballroom. Eleanor lowered her eyes with the faintest smile because she already knew where his words were leading. Vincent turned slightly toward the sound of Naomi arranging empty coffee cups near the back of the room. "Naomi Carter, would you please come here for a moment?" Every conversation stopped. Naomi looked around, convinced he must have meant someone else. Eleanor nodded gently, encouraging her forward. Naomi walked across the ballroom with quiet uncertainty until she stood beside Vincent beneath the warm light of the chandelier. He smiled before speaking again. "Since losing my eyesight, thousands of people have spoken to me. They offered sympathy, admiration, advice, caution, and endless politeness. I appreciated every good intention, but almost everyone forgot one simple thing. Before I am anything else, I am a man." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable sincerity. The first morning Naomi greeted me, she did not perform respect. She offered humanity. She warned me when I needed information, not because she doubted my ability, but because she trusted my independence. She spoke honestly instead of perfectly. She reminded me of conversations I thought had disappeared from my life forever. The ballroom stood completely silent. Naomi felt tears gather in her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from recognizing the quiet truth behind his words. She answered with the same gentle honesty that had guided every conversation between them. "My father taught me that dignity is never something we give another person. It already belongs to them. We only choose whether to recognize it." Vincent nodded slowly. "Thank you for helping me remember that." Around the room, applause began softly before growing into warm, heartfelt appreciation that reached every corner of the ballroom. Yet the loudest moment came after the applause faded away, when employees, guests, and friends looked at one another differently than they had only weeks before. They no longer saw a powerful man defined by blindness or a housemaid defined by her position. They saw two people who had changed each other through ordinary kindness spoken without fear. And in that quiet evening, the Moretti estate remembered something far greater than influence or wealth. It remembered what dignity truly sounds like.